I'm Georgie Howlett. I'm a director at Claremont, and this session is all about boosting and how to build sustainable behaviour change. I'm going to share a couple of slides to give a short overview, and then I will speak with Stefan Herzog, who's joining us today. Stefan is a senior research scientist at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, where he leads the boosting decision-making research area, so highly relevant for today. Looking forward to our chat. So, to understand boosting, it helps to understand nudges. I'm sure many people on this webinar are familiar, but to bring us all onto the same page, one of the most famous examples is the fly in the urinal. Early 1990s, cleaning manager in Amsterdam airport was frustrated by the spillage around the hundreds of urinals in the building, increased his workload, used more resources. It smelled not particularly nice. So famously, he etched small images of flies into some of the urinals. And that resulted in an 80% reduction in spillage and improved hygiene. And I think it's a useful example just to bring the thinking to life for anyone who isn't familiar with nudges. They are a way to guide the behaviour of individuals without their knowledge, all the while giving them the impression of having the freedom of choice. And the components of which involve choice architecture, so subtle changes to the environment in which decisions are made and then influence behaviour. It involves, it's non-coercive, so a true nudge doesn't stop, prohibit options or significantly change economic incentives. So, for example, banning junk food is not a nudge, but placing healthy food options at eye level in a cafe is. And it influences predictable behaviour. So nudges work by taking advantage of people's cognitive biases like inertia or the tendency to go with a default option. And they can be very effective. So much like the fly in the urinal, there have been notable successes from nudge-based campaigns like changing what's at eye height, as I just mentioned, when paying at a checkout, or the speed smileys or not smileys. But they can also be quite annoying. So everyone knows the famous autoplay on Netflix, and some of them risk becoming wallpaper. And from an efficacy perspective, interventions that fail to promote agency, i.e. they lead with this kind of deficit model of human cognition, as many nudging interventions do, can risk leaving citizens in the dark and unable to take ownership of the process of behaviour change. And this can result in a couple of things. So it can mean that the interventions don't last. There's the kind of psychological reactance when people feel like they're being manipulated. I think we all resort to being toddlers and we don't like it very much. And it can even have backfiring effects. So nudges might work with something like urinals, but it's arguably less effective with some of the big picture global crises that humanity is facing, which require something that runs a little deeper. So conversely, boosts, they build on people's strengths. So not just as individuals, but as inherently social creatures with the ability, the motivation to act collectively. This kind of shared identity can help sustain adherence to demanding measures in hard times. Boosts, if we were to summarize them, they strengthen skills and motivational competencies to help people make better choices. They are rooted in empowerment and in agency. They focus on, as I've mentioned before, education, but also transparent communication. And they ultimately foster autonomy and long-term change, and they can be a far more sustainable approach to solving some of our more complex challenges. Importantly, it can also include self-nudges, so we can give people the tools to understand themselves and how to create their own nudges as stepping stones to a more habitual behaviour. So if we were to set these just at kind of contrast, just to understand some of the things that we've just summarised, nudging is libertarian paternalism. The view of humans is cognitively biased, limited, irrational beings, whereas boosting is about autonomy and agency, and humans are capable, adaptable, collaborative. Nudging manipulates the context, so placements, defaults, framing. Boosting builds decision-making tools, so reasoning skills, motivation. Nudging can include subtle changes in choice architecture. Boosting develops skills and competencies for informed autonomous decisions. And nudging very much focuses on individual behaviour, whereas boosting can focus on that social and collective, which can be very powerful, as well as the individual. So as I've said, nudging short-term, more marginal gains, boosting long-term sustainable change. So what's appropriate for the things that you're trying to do if you're asking yourself the question, okay, well, what should I be nudging or boosting here? nudges can be very effective for changes to the kind of system one, quick, non-analytical thinking. They could be low in cost, good for quick fixes, but the behaviour can also quite easily like shift back when that nudge is taken away. It's not as deeply rooted. Whereas boosts are good when you can find a route in to engage people in that deeper way, in that kind of more values-based, identity-led choices, driven by more kind of like conscious decision-making processes and a more sustained change. And importantly, I think it doesn't have to be an either or. So obviously we're setting these at contrast to help define and understand them, but the best approach might be a combination of the two. So just to kind of clarify what different kinds of boosts there are, we've got knowledge, that's improving literacy in the broadest sense. That's digital literacy, risk literacy, financial literacy, health literacy. For example, adopting the skills of professional fact checkers through lateral reading, understanding drug labels, recognizing symptoms. You've got decision making, where we can share tools with people to improve their decision making, such as decision making trees. And the paper that introduced the concept of boosting used an example about, for motivation, how to help people overcome maths anxiety by enabling parents and children to engage more playfully with maths tasks. So just sort of changing the environment around it, making it more motivating for people. And then just to wrap up this section before we chat to Stefan, a couple of examples of boosting in action from Claremont over the years. So one example is for Alzheimer's Research UK, where we designed a campaign to teach people about brain health rather than focusing on the symptoms of Alzheimer's. So we developed content and tools to empower and educate people, which was a very helpful shift in tone around a health condition which people often feel they can't do anything about. And the other example we've got here is children born into low-income families hear up to about 30 million fewer words than those born into middle-class families. And this lack of exposure to vocabulary in the first 3 years of life can put those children at a disadvantage by the time they start school. Now, we work with Save the Children to design, make and test a range of prototype interventions to encourage parents to sing, talk, play with their children more and have an impact on that. And it's a very collaborative, iterative process. It's rooted in empowerment rather than this deficit model of human cognition that we've been talking about. So I'd like to welcome Stefan now. Stefan is a senior research scientist heading Boosting Decision Making Group at Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
So you've recently published a paper where you argue that policy must move beyond traditional nudging, as we've just been talking about, especially when it comes to addressing the complex challenges of our time in particular, such as climate change and the pandemic. Why do you think this is the case? What's your view?
I mean, you've showed some really nice examples of choice architecture that we might encounter, like in the cafeteria, that helpfully put food into the eye level. But many choice architectures are not designed by benevolent choice architects, but by people who have commercial interests in their mind. Like, think about the engineering of Pringles. Like there is, it's unbelievable. You can search on Google Scholar what kind of science actually goes into those. Or if you think about the online world that actually makes money off our attention, tries to keep us hooked. There are many environments we live in that are ultra processed and I mean, regulation and the governments are kind of catching up with this, but we're still, I mean, we're talking about social media bans like 10 years after social media really took off. So it takes time. And so what we argue is that we need competent citizens as a first line of defense. We shouldn't replace governmental and regulatory action, but we can't wait either. And so that's why we think teaching people micro skills that can help them in their daily lives battle these unfriendly environments should be a priority.
Yeah, that makes sense. And do you have any kind of examples of ones that you've seen that you think are particularly successful in kind of giving people exactly what you've been saying in terms of like the skills and the tools?
Yeah, I mean, for some of them, I have to be honest, I don't know whether there is actually any data on how to evaluate them, but
it's always a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, but there are some amazing initiatives, let's say in the online world. There's like Humane Tech, an interesting website where they kind of teach people how to take charge of their notification on their device. So instead of trying to ignore your device when it's demanding your attention, if you have a calm minute, you go in the settings and change them. And this has immense downstream effects if you kind of front load the effort. Or maybe another example, something that's called the Dutch reach. So this is there is this problem of dooring. So if bicycle drivers drive on the road and then car drivers open the door without watching, there's a campaign and it's been adopted now also in the US where you teach people to always use the opposite hand. And I apologize for viewers now in the UK, but
The other way around.
for me in Berlin, it would mean that I would use my right hand to go to the door on the left of the car, and by doing so, I'm forced to look back, and I can see the bicycle driver. And then once it's a habit, I don't even have to think about it anymore. Or maybe as a third example, there is some amazing research done in Germany in schools where they teach self-regulation to kids. So how to make simple if-then rules that help them, for example, to kind of schedule or make their work at home. And it has shown that this significantly increased the likelihood of people, students enrolling in advanced secondary school 3 years later. And this is also a skill for life. If you can learn not to try to master willpower to get through everything, but just trying to actually make yourself and the environment work for yourself.
Yeah. Is that if then rule, is that an example of because in the paper they talk about sort of decision trees. Would you say that's an example of that in action, or is that a slightly different thing?
I think it's a bit different. And I mean, as I understand, many people in the audience also come from a health background, and they might be familiar with this research on implementation intentions. So you basically try to find a trigger in the environment. And then this kind of, triggers your behavior because there's always this problem. You can teach people, or people often know what they need to do, but they might not think about it when they should do it. And so if you can automatically kind of activate that knowledge at the right time, then it's much more actionable than just knowing that is one thing, but knowing how to make it actionable in your life. And so I think that's what the F10 rules are. But it's true that many simple decision trees, if you, I don't know, have a decision tree to triage patients in an emergency room or in actually in an emergency, like there's this simple tree, like does the person walk? If so, okay. If the person doesn't walk, you go to the next one. That's true. That's also an if-then rule, but a bit of a different kind.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. I think it's interesting, isn't it? The idea, because obviously boosting's been articulated as counter to nudge. It's sort of taking us away from that space. But I do think it's interesting that people can include self nudges as a thing. You're just basically putting the power with the person, aren't you? You're sort of saying like this is how you can remind you if you really want to do more exercise, leaving your shoes by the door, sitting in your exercise clothes, whatever it is, but you're making the decision, so the autonomy sits with you. So it's a nuance, but I think it's a really important one, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, your autonomy is one thing. The other thing is that, I mean, of course, there are a lot of self-help books trying to make some profit of we don't know ourselves, but I think I would argue we know ourselves better than the median policymaker because nudges for the most part are one size fits all, and they cannot tailor to different preferences of people, except that maybe that you opt out of a nudge or of a default. But the nice thing about self nudges is once you know about kind of the behavioral science principles that you can use to build your own nudges, you decide in which domain and what do I really want in that domain. And so it's kind of a combination of your own knowledge of your situation and your autonomy. And that's actually such a nice combination. And maybe it even makes people more resistant to manipulation to some extent, because you are ideally teaching people about the basics of behavioral science, which also includes maybe persuasion or other topics, which is, I think, also interesting in the online domain. And there are some nice examples of research showing that even super short videos, like 1 minute or maybe less, can teach people common manipulation tactics that are used in propaganda or other persuasion campaigns, and make them more resistant to those and detect them, and are less likely to fall for misinformation then.
Yeah, I think that point that you were saying about like people know themselves very well, that's sort of sits at the heart of a lot of how we go about our work. We often talk about nothing about us without us, which is why co-design sits so centrally to a lot of our
Mm.
work, is kind of going, we as observers don't necessarily know the answer. So it's so important to kind of come up with these solutions alongside people, because that's the best way you're going to come up with something that's actually going to work. Um, so just to come back to some of the work you've done, your work also highlights how like online environments can be engineered in ways that actually erode people's competencies. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I mean, I earlier already alluded to the attention grabbing aspect. So we are really, I mean, it's maybe a cliche to say, but we are the product, because every free service you use means somebody needs to make money out of you in another way through
Mm.
ads, and so people, companies and everybody's vying for your attention. And so if you know that, and I already talked about, for example, managing your notification or managing your attention, or a concept that we call critical ignoring, so that it's not only important to do critical thinking, but also to know what not to engage with,
And to
what's not even
filter. Yeah.
what's not even worth bothering. And
Yeah.
that also relates to what you mentioned earlier in your presentation, the lateral reading. So how to
Yeah.
be a fact checker, for example, because if you come across something, a source you don't recognize, and you want to know, should I trust it? What most people then do is even Stanford history professors, they go up and down the website, look at every detail and the design, and does it have references, which is not good, because even 10 years ago, it was relatively easy to come up with professional looking websites. And now
Yeah.
with generative AI coding agents, you can create a website in 2 minutes, basically. But what fact checkers do is they ignore the website and go to Google and see what other sources say about it. So that would be one example how to think about the information that's out there. But maybe also the notion of pre-bunking I find very interesting, so that you kind of mentally inoculate people with against certain forms of misinformation, because then they are less likely to fall for it. And it's always better to pre-bunk than to debunk, because once you have the information out there, it's harder to get it
Yes,
back.
and sometimes debunking myths just draws attention, and that's got its own sort of problems, hasn't it,
Yeah,
cognitively in terms of behavioral science. I love the idea of
yeah.
mental inoculation. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think on so I mean in the resources that I think you were sharing, there is also some nice examples of pre-bunking, but also the debunking, that there are best practices to do it if you want to do it. So I
Mm-hmm.
think there's like the sandwich, like start with the fact, end with the fact, warn people that there is now wrong information coming up, but
Yeah.
importantly, fill the void, because if you tell them this is wrong, it often plays a role, and people feel like, oh, now I don't understand why it is, or why would have people said that in the first place. And if you give them that, then people get closure and more likely to go with it. So I think if you have to debunk, luckily there's also best
There's a way
practices
of
out
doing
there.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah, okay, no, that's useful to know. And it feels like something that's becoming increasingly important, isn't it? This particular theme in terms
yeah,
of misinformation, just because there's like trust and navigating that
yeah.
in today's society is becoming ever more complex. You've touched on this a little already, but we're going to talk about kind of what practical boosts communications teams can build into their campaigns to help the public kind of navigate misinformation and manipulative digital design. Is there anything that you wanted to kind of add on some of the things that you've mentioned in terms of tools that people could
Um,
use?
I think, I mean, I've mentioned a couple, like pre-bunking. We talked about the
Mhm.
debunking aspect. Maybe, I mean, it depends on the campaign, but what I really find very charming is if campaigns, um, I mean, boosting works by changing people's competences. And so if part of those competences or micro skills you can teach people is how to, let's say, not fall for misinformation with, then that could be part of a campaign to think about what would be maybe even skills that are, I mean, there will be things that are central to the goals of the campaign, but also help protecting people against false information about what you're trying to do. Let's say about, I don't know, false information about vaccines or other things. So it's not only about how
Yeah.
do I mean, from a notching perspective, you can think about, I mean, there's all this research on how do you need to design reminder SMSs or other things, and does it help to pre-book a meeting for people that then they have to cancel as opposed to for them to opt in. There's all this stuff,
Yeah.
but then also there's the question: how do you get people on track and understand when people are trying to manipulate them? So I think maybe that could be combined. And this general idea you mentioned about self-nudging, if you teach people about behavioral science, even if it's just one or two things, I think that can add up and make just people more competent and gives them more agency in designing their own environments, like being your citizen's choice architect, like your own choice architect, as opposed to
Yeah.
someone else with whatever interest they have in mind.
Yeah, one of the things that I particularly like about kind of the concept of boosting, but I think is sort of perhaps still in the early stages of, like you say,
Mm,
data and proof and all that kind of stuff, is the kind of inherently social nature
mm,
of humans and kind of like actually how when we can kind of come together. And I think again, one of the examples in the original paper is about kind of COVID and how like the initial view was like, oh, people couldn't possibly sustain these like such harsh measures for so long. And then
yeah, yeah,
actually, obviously with exceptions, but people did, and it proved
yeah,
that kind of sense of like coming together can be really powerful,
yeah,
which I
yeah.
think I don't know if you've got any kind of thoughts on like where you've seen that work well or like where you think there's potential.
Yeah. Maybe before we go there, one comment I would like to make is
Mm,
that it's kind of amazing when you think back to the COVID-19 pandemic. And before that, if you follow nudging and you basically, your assumption is that people are like Homer Simpson, basically. And then the pandemic hit, and then you turn around and ask people to comprehend health statistics, the exponential growth. You ask for media competences. You ask them to trust science and to be pro-social and care for others and engage in self-control and implement the protective measures such as quarantine and adapt to remote working environments and all these kind of things, which clearly means that you think of people as capable beings. And so, but I think it's a bit weird to do that after telling, I mean, people for maybe years before that basically people are irrational and not particularly clever. So I think it's just also very good if you, I guess, as any communicator from government or NGOs or other entities to have this, yeah, take people seriously, because then this, I think, will foster the social and community aspects that you mentioned. I find this topic very interesting, and I have to say that most of the kind of scientific work I know from boosting doesn't necessarily talk about that very much, but I think that's actually a gap. So that's something I'm also looking forward to think about more. What would that mean? I mean, we had examples of in families like parents with math anxiety, how they can overcome that to talk to
yeah,
people. I
together.
mean, the
Yeah.
example you mentioned about exposing young children to more words. But
Yeah.
I think how does that work on the collective level? So that's actually one of the research questions we have. What does it mean to boost collectives or even
Yeah.
collective intelligence, like our ability to solve complex problems as smaller and bigger groups in a society? So I think that's very interesting. So I'm
I agree.
actually,
It's a fascinating space for it to go because I think traditionally, I think a lot of behavioral science has sort of looked at the person, the individual, and
mm,
it's all very focused like that. Whereas, you know, a person doesn't exist in a bubble. You've got the whole system around them and you've got the people. And I think,
yeah,
being able to kind of move our thinking more into that space is really interesting. Um, so we at Claremont, we often design campaigns for long-term behavior change, so
yeah.
not one-off actions. Like,
Mm.
what have you learned about designing boosts that continue to work after the intervention ends?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we touched upon, I think, now many times during our conversation is that boosts, or maybe if we start with nudges,
Yeah.
they kind of bypass your cognition.
Hmm.
I mean, maybe as a side effect, something changes in your mind, but basically they're just trying to steer your behavior. And so if you remove the intervention, it falls back, right? Like imagine you would remove the flies in the urinals, or you would put junk food back on eye level, or
It's
actually to
just
go
back.
out of maybe you have a very nice cafeteria, but then you go outside and you go to the supermarket and it's a different environment.
Yeah.
So clearly, if you want to have long-term and generalizable changes, you need to change something about people's cognition. And I mean, that's nothing new. That's nothing that boosting has invented as a framework. I mean, or many behavior change frameworks think about that. So really, it is changing something about how people think. so that it actually works in different environments, maybe not even the ones that you have thought about particularly. So this is so it means also if you can test that, like can you, I mean, a lot of the research doesn't also look at long-term consequences. So it also would be nice to test more. Well, after 3 months after the intervention, do you still see a residual effect, or do you need boosters, so to speak,
to cope.
to get it back up? And maybe a second insight is, and we've talked about implementation intentions before, these if-then rules. So in my mind, you often have a core, like maybe you want to teach people how to detect symptoms of heart failure, or you want to teach them how to detect manipulation tactics online. That's one thing, but you want that to be actionable or activated when it needs to be. So you need, so I think of it almost like a delivery vehicle where you put in your core boost, but then you have, let's say, implementation intention or something else that's more from a motivational or goal-directed psychology perspective. How do you make it kind of engage when it should be? And so that's another thing that I'm thinking a lot about how to. It's basically implementation science. I mean, which is also a long-standing tradition. They think all about these kind of things, and maybe that's the other insight that behavioral change research. Some of those people have very close connections or very well familiar with implementation science, and others are not. So I think we can also learn a lot from implementation science to then combine these ideas and how to kind of package competence interventions so that they actually arrive and get activated when they need to.
It's all about the right ingredients, isn't it? In the
Yes.
mixing pot and all the different things that you choose to draw on, depending on fundamentally what you're
Yes.
trying to do. Your work warns about the danger of boosting being misused to put responsibility back onto individuals. This feels like a particularly hot topic at the moment, isn't it? It's sort of like who's to blame for all the things going on, and are we putting, the focus on individuals? I think
Yes.
there's even been some articles out and some books coming out recently that talk a lot about this.
Yes.
What guardrails should organisations like ours put in place to ensure that boosts complement system level work rather than are used to kind of like shift blame and focus on the
Yeah.
individual?
To be honest, that's a really good question, which I don't necessarily have a good answer. So my current thinking, but that's just the beginning, is that it could be part of the campaign. So that there is a way to also communicate that there is a need for system level change.
This
But
and this,
yeah,
Yeah.
but frame behavioral interventions and boosts or other approaches as a first line of defense because we need competent citizens. So like you need something now, but also it's important to do more. And there is research on the question whether nudges or boosts behavioral interventions, whether they crowd out people's demand for system level interventions.
Yeah.
And I think the evidence is mixed, or at least there is also evidence showing that it doesn't have to, can actually even be a catalyst. And so actually having more of that kind of research and experience with campaigns in the field would be important to see how we can actually create synergies so that it actually motivates people to possibly also engage in their
Yeah, it's a bit
communities or
like
politically.
it's a bit like the myth of to change behavior, you have to shift awareness and then the behavior, and sometimes it can come the other way around and like the
Yeah,
awareness grows. Like it's similar to that, isn't it? It's sort of
yeah,
like
yeah,
in increasing someone's awareness and kind of understanding of
yeah,
something
yeah.
through the behavior, then they can kind of become more impassioned about,
Yeah, maybe
the
one model that I really like is during COVID-19, there was this, I don't know, but the Swiss cheese model of mitigation measures, where they say like an Emmentaler cheese which with holes, every measure, a boost, a regulation has holes, but if you put them together, they're usually not at the
then
same
they do.
place. And
Yeah, okay.
so
It's
and so
nice.
maybe it's the same thing. Maybe there are analogs we can use in framing about how, yeah, we need a toolbox. Like there's no silver bullet for any complex problem. Would be silly and foolish to claim that.
Yeah.
And so maybe that can even be baked into the campaign.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's probably all we've got time for today. Thanks, Stefan, for those insights and anecdotes to bring this concept to life. Thanks to everyone for joining. We've got a fair few of these bite-sized events and our full webinars coming up, so please sign up to Claire Mail or follow us on LinkedIn if you're not already. to keep up with the latest of these. The links should all be popping up in the chat, as well as a link to Stefan's website, which has got all sorts of useful resources. And do get in touch if there's something specific you'd like to ask us about. Have productive days, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.